Mike Leavitt, former governor of Utah, former Secretary of Health and Human Services. Thank you so much for being part of Three Questions.
Thank you.
What concerns you the most right now about the coronavirus pandemic?
I'm concerned that we use this as a period to prepare, not a period to panic. Pandemics happen. They're a biologic fact of life. They have happened 3 times in the last 100 years, 10 times in the last 300 years. The problem is they happen far enough apart that each generation forgets just how important it is to be prepared. So preparation can make a huge difference, and I'm hoping that Utahns will use the time productively and be ready.
President Trump declared a national emergency just today as we are recording this. In light of how quickly the coronavirus, novel coronavirus, has spread, did he declare it soon enough?
I don't have any question that there are reasons that this will be helpful. Whether it's soon enough at this point is about the past is not relevant. What's important is the future. We have time at this point still to do things that will be very useful. The president triggers an emergency, a declaration of emergency, really to trigger some emergency powers that likely would not have been appropriate to exercise until this point.
Such as?
Well, for example, there are authorities that the Secretary of Health has after a declaration of emergency comes that would allow for us to waive certain requirements in the development of vaccines or in the development of payment for health insurance, Medicaid and Medicare. We still aren't at the point where where we've lost any time on any of that, but in order to do it, the declaration needs to be in place.
You have served at that level of federal government where you are dealing with this kind of outbreak. H1N1, for instance, is what you dealt with as Health and Human Services Secretary. Tell us what is going on right now at that level of government to stem the spread of coronavirus.
The federal government has a very important role, but it's not the only role. The federal government can develop a vaccine. A lot of work is going into that. It won't be available for roughly a year, but it'll be important because at that we'll likely still be dealing with this virus. The federal government can help state and local governments prepare by providing them with resources. The federal government can accumulate a lot of information that informs all of the decisions that are being made at the local level. Those are unique things that the federal government can do. But anyone who believes that the federal government can come riding to the rescue will be tragically disappointed, not because the federal government lacks a will or the wallet to help, but because a pandemic is a unique kind of emergency. It happens everywhere at the same time. When Katrina happened or 9/11, the emergency resources that were deployed to those scenes were state resources. In the case of a pandemic, state resources have to stay in the state because everyone's experiencing basically at the same time, which makes this a uniquely local experience. And there's a role for everyone. State has a role, city has a role, churches have a role, schools have a role, families have a role. This is something that requires us all to have a pandemic plan.
Now, as Health and Human Services Secretary, you came up with a pandemic plan. Describe that to us, and is it being used right now as we speak?
Well, it was with the H5N1 when I think the country, that was a virus that people worried would have a pandemic potential. It just became very evident to us that we weren't prepared and that we needed to do whatever necessary to enhance our general preparedness, because a pandemic the preparation for a pandemic isn't dramatically different than what you do for a weather disaster, a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake or a terrorist event. And so we did put together a national plan. It took 3.5 years. We spent almost $7 billion in developing it. And I'm happy to say that the pandemic plan was used by the Obama administration. It's now being used by the Trump administration. It's being improved and changed as it's gone, but there is a plan, and the truth is a lot of good things are happening right now in the United States. Unprecedented things. We are suspending play in professional sports. We're telling people they don't need to go to church for a while. We're asking people particularly older people, to stay home, and they're doing it. All of those things will make a difference, and that's a function of the fact that we've spent some time thinking about how to prepare for it, and people are responding.
We're seeing a run on the stores. The shelves are empty of many items right now, even as we speak, and keeping up with the demand is a challenge for many stores. Is that an overreaction on the part of the public to this pandemic?
Well, let's just say it's human nature. I'm sure that most of the people who are standing in line at Costco wish they had shopped a couple of weeks earlier. It isn't that they just came to that conclusion, it's just that they've been busy. And candidly, there's always a bit of skepticism when these things start. We've been through some false starts, and so it doesn't seem unreasonable to wait a while. Not a good idea, but it doesn't seem unreasonable at the time. So I don't see it as overreaction. I do see it as an unfortunate procrastination, and things would be better if they hadn't.
Yeah, people should have followed the panic now and avoid the rush
That's
axiom.
Perhaps so.
How has the inability to screen enough people in the United States for coronavirus hindered the response to this pandemic?
A lot is being made about that. However, I will tell you that it's one of the things that's true about pandemics is that anything you say in advance seems alarmist. Anything, no matter how well or how quickly you've done it, after it starts, is inadequate. And I'm not suggesting that what they did was perfect. It undoubtedly was not. But the fog of war takes over, and things aren't always as perfect as you'd like them to be. Here's an example. FDA has the responsibility to keep the testing accurate. CDC has the mission of getting it done quickly. Sometimes accurate and quick collide.
Yeah.
And in this case, one of the things that happened was that FDA said, we're not sure that's accurate. CDC said, but we've got to get it out quickly. I think in the end, if you were to say to people, what could we have done better? They would say, we should have opened up the testing more quickly, and it would be a better idea if we had a way of being able to keep track of the data. Now, it's unfortunate that that happened, but we're just at the beginning of this process, not at the end. We need data for what's going to happen from this point forward. There's plenty of time to get that right, but they need to get it right.
The World Health Organization, in its news conference today, said that it is better to be fast than accurate at this point, because you can always go back and correct. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, I think the World Health Organization has it right, but I think you'd also, if you went to FDA, they would say, yes, but we're in charge of it being right, and we don't want to be giving people false information. And to people who get false information, that's important. So they're right. We want to get it in the hands of people. We want to get testing. We need to get information. And hopefully that will now flow as time goes on.
There is actual risk, as you well know, as an old insurance man. There is actual risk and there is perceived risk. In the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is worse?
Well, look, we don't know a lot about what is going to occur. We're getting information from around the world. All of this is happening, and that uncertainty causes us to say, I'm going to go to whatever extreme I need to make certain that I'm protected. Over time, as the reality of this sets in, our reactions will be calibrated by the circumstances then. I think this is human nature.
In a pandemic, I would imagine there are business owners, small business owners, who are hesitant to close their doors, and understandably so. There's a lot of money to be lost. But there comes a point at which they have to close the doors and send everybody home. What is that tipping point? Where is that?
Well, I think that the fact that the governor has asked people to be conscious of any gatherings above a certain level, I think that the CDC has now begun to make those statements. I think it becomes evident to people. One thing about a pandemic is that people need to make their own decisions, and it will not happen at the same time in the same way. If you live in St. George, your situation may be different than in Salt Lake. And so the important thing is that you're listening to local health officials who have the information and have some experience in dealing with these things, rather than simply make your own decisions, or maybe I should say, you should certainly heavily weigh what you're being told by local health authorities.
Current Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar last night said that President Trump took bold action in banning travel from Europe to the United States. Now, Azar is a part of the Trump administration. In a situation like this, how can we tell what is political speech and what isn't?
Well, that's a good reason that we ought to be taking our cues from local health officials. I have great respect for Secretary Azar. We work together, and we went through the H5N1 together, and I think he's a man of good judgment. Clearly, there are at times different areas of concern. I think the president was reflecting for quite a while a skepticism that many people had about this. Some of the things that were said were likely or hard to defend, given knowing what we now know. There are people with different points of view on whether closing borders makes a difference. I don't know. The truth of the matter is that's behind us. We don't gain anything from spending our time thinking about what happened 3 weeks ago. Our purpose ought to be worrying about what's going to happen 3 weeks from now.
There is a fine line between adequately informing the public and fomenting hysteria. There's a fine line there. How do politicians, health officials, and we in the media walk that fine line without creating more hysteria?
Again, I think we ought to be acknowledging that some quite remarkable things are happening among the American people right now. The closure of businesses, the termination of air travel, the cancellation or suspension of entire schedules, professional and major traditions being set aside for this year to protect the American people and their health. That's a reflection of the fact that the word is out and that people are being informed. Now, are they being informed with the volume up a little too loud? Well, you could make that argument. But the reality is lives are going to be saved as a result of the fact that everybody knows now about the coronavirus. If you had gone back 60 days ago, that wouldn't have been the case. If you reflect back on the pandemic of 1918, where 3,500 Utah people died in 4 months, and if you were to use today's population figure, that would be roughly 25,000 people would have died in a comparable situation. One of the things that contributed to that was that they didn't have access to good information. I read today that 92% of the population now understands the threat that the coronavirus poses. That is a civil or civic protection. We're doing good things. We may avoid, as a culture, by doing these things, a tragedy and an economic collapse that could have happened had we not done these things.
You were Secretary of Health and Human Services during H1N1. You were governor of Utah during the SARS outbreak in 2002. Certainly there were lessons learned through both of those epidemics and those events. What are some of those lessons that were learned then that are being applied now?
Well, we were reminded at how local a pandemic is, because you can't expect the federal government to do everything. You have to do a lot of things yourself. We learned that there is a role for everyone. There's a role for families to have a pandemic plan, for businesses, for churches, for schools, for universities, for cities, for counties, for states, for the federal government. Everyone has a role. We learned that that they are earth-changing experiences when they unfold. They change the politics, they change the economy, they change the sociology of areas when they're not responded to properly. In short, we learned that this isn't something you want to goof with. When it happens and you think there's a risk, we need to respond. We learned that it's important to inform people, but not inflame them. And now, are we doing this perfectly? No. Perfection at a moment like this is not to be expected. But we are learning and have learned and will continue to get better at this. We'll get through this. It will not be a pleasant time the next couple of months. There will be things that happen that we wish had not happened. But we do have control over some of these events. And where we have control, we should exercise it. And where we have lessons, we should learn them. And where there are people we can help, we should help them. That's what a community is about, and it's the way you ultimately defeat the harm of a virus named the coronavirus.
It's always hard to know what we don't know in any given situation, but what don't we know about the coronavirus?
Well, there's still a lot we don't know about how it's transmitted. There's still a lot we don't know about the way, how virulent it is. We suspect and have good evidence that it's a highly dangerous situation for anyone who is 70 years old or older. There's suspicion that it may not be nearly as harmful to those who are younger. That informs us. But the main thing we don't know yet is how will this virus mutate? Viruses change. Viruses are in pursuit of hosts, and when they run out of hosts, they start to try and mutate to find new ways to crack the code of the human genome to break in. And so we're having to monitor this very closely as we go, because they can change and the priorities may change, but we're very much at war with a microbe, and we've got the science and the will to win.
I want to touch on the uninsured here for just a moment, and I would imagine that that was a concern of yours when you were Health and Human Services Secretary. In a situation like this, where testing is so essential, what about the uninsured and the underinsured who can't afford to pay for a test? What happens to them, and how do we make sure that those populations that are most at risk have the testing available to them?
So I feel confident that that is a shared aspiration that we all have. I think it bridges political parties. And one of the things that I believe we'll see come out of the declaration of emergency that the President made today will be changes in regulation that allow the federal government and other parts of the government to be helpful in an emergency in cases like that.
Based on everything that you know right now about this pandemic, where do you see it going? How does it ultimately end up?
Well, we'll have some influence on that. If it were left to its own device, we have modeled pandemic viruses for a century and know that there's a sort of slow build-up and then a kind of hockey stick. It takes about 6 weeks, and then after 6 weeks it begins to fall for another 6 weeks, and then it'll go for a while, and sometimes it'll pop back up. The problem with that big hockey stick is that it means that so many people are ill at the same time that it overruns our capacity to respond. So the objective here is to do the things we're doing, closing businesses, closing schools, universities, not holding public events, taking away from the virus the ability to jump from person to person in a geometric way. We hope in doing so then to make that first peak a little lower, and it may be sustained for a little bit longer, but we have the ability to have our health resources respond when a person is really sick. That's why what we're doing is so vital, and I have some optimism that we'll accomplish that. Now, we're going to have a couple of tough months. That's just the way the math is, it's the way the science is, it's the way history tells us this happens. But we'll get through it. And people have some influence on the way it affects them. I have parents that are right in the heart of that population that could be most at risk. I love them. I'm doing everything I can to make certain that they take the precautions that are necessary to protect them. I think the same is true for most families. If we are using this time to prepare and not necessarily to panic, just do what we're told that will help, the chances of us being affected by this are dramatically lower than if we just do nothing.
Mike Leavitt, former governor of Utah and former Secretary of Health and Human Services, thank you so much for being part of 3 Questions.
Thank you.